Well, so far, from my understanding, this has been a wonderful event, and I feel very privileged and lucky to be invited to be part of it. You have 3 individuals in front of you here on stage that have different experiences to share and what their relationship with Walter Capps was and still is and how it's influenced our lives. And so I'm going to begin by introducing the 3 of us, and then we're going to talk about how Walter Capps touched our lives. Sound good? Okay. So this is the reading part. The rest won't be reading. Hopefully what we will be doing is having more of a dialogue and then providing some time for you to, if you have any questions, and then some audience comments. And I'd love to see a continuation of the wonderful comments that I was hearing before this particular panel. So, speaker bios. My name is Katya Armistead. My pronouns are she and her. I am an assistant vice chancellor and dean of student life here at UC Santa Barbara. Let's see what was written about me. I oversee organizational departments. So the AVC part is basically within the Division of Student Affairs. I have about 10 departments that report up through me. Also, I am basically the dean of students, and that means a whole bunch of things. But how I would define it best is I support and I advocate and I uplift and I listen to students, and I try to provide their perspective in places maybe they don't have access to. I work a lot with student leaders. So it says here, overseeing organizational departments, programs, policies, and initiatives that promote growth and achievement. I have a doctorate degree from UCSB in educational leadership. I also received my bachelor's degree in sociology from UCSB. I have coached professionals and college students in the areas of leadership, diversity and inclusion, organizational development, crisis management, and advising. I co-direct or I co-teach a class within religious studies in partnership with the Capps Center, Civic Engagement Scholars Program. And that has been a true pleasure, and I've learned so much by doing that. I also teach in the Gervitz Graduate School of Education, a course for upper division undergraduates, educational leadership development, and that has been a great pleasure. So I also have with me Tim. Tim Kring has created and run numerous TV shows, including Crossing Jordan, Touch, and Heroes, and become an industry-leading creator in multi-platform storytelling over a 35-year career in Hollywood. His writing focuses on themes of interconnectivity and global consciousness with the goal of achieving what he calls social benefit storytelling. Ooh, I can't wait to hear more about that. Shawn Landres has a distinguished record of research, leadership, and impact across the social good sectors. He has chaired Los Angeles County's Quality and Productivity Commission, as well as Santa Monica's Planning and Social Services Commissions. Co-founder of Jumpstart Labs and a senior fellow at UCLA Luskin. Shawn is a board member of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and Santa Monica Bay Area Human Relations Council. He has a PhD in religious studies here at UC Santa Barbara. So welcome, you both. I've just been talking a lot, so I'm going to go to one of you next to talk about what's your relationship with Walter Capps. Tell me a little bit more.
Well, it's a bit of a. I think there's a little bit of a story to tell before how that happened, because I think I'm sort of a unique voice in this event in that I was not an academic, and I actually predated the Vietnam course, so my involvement with Walter was just he was a professor of classes that I was taking as an undergraduate. But to give you some context of all of it, because I grew up about an hour north of here, in a community that had very little interest in education. I don't think we had passed a school bond in, I don't know, 50 years in this community. And I actually went to, I graduated from, at the time, the only unaccredited high school in California. So education was just not very, wasn't stressed in my life. I also, on top of that, had learning disabilities that were never diagnosed. I just sat in the back of the classroom and didn't pick up on much. And so I took a filmmaking class at a junior college, and decided that's what I wanted to do. Wanted to get into film. And this film teacher that I had said, don't go to film school as an undergraduate, because film school is sort of a trade school. It's a technical thing, and he said, you should go and learn how to think, and learn how to read, and learn how to write, and take a sort of broader education. Then you can always go to film school after that, and once you've done that. So at the time, UCSB now, to get into UCSB is a very difficult thing. But I have to say, and I don't even really recall how it happened, but I actually don't think, I don't think I applied to go to school here. I actually think all I did was enroll. I think I just came down and I paid.
That's how it happened in those days.
Yeah. I just enrolled. I paid $214 for a quarter, for 15 units in a quarter. And I started taking classes with the idea that I was going to learn to educate. I was going to educate myself for the first time. And and to back up a tiny bit even further, the interest in the religious studies part of it was, I was thinking sort of about life and my meaning, the meaning of life, and what my purpose was, and all of that. And there was something that my grandmother had said. She had died a couple years before, and I must have been about 16 or 17 years old. She said, I always regretted that you kids didn't have more of a Jewish upbringing. My parents were atheists, but we were traditionally Jewish and some culturally Jewish, but not religiously Jewish. And she said, I just really regret that you kids didn't grow up with a real strong, Jewish identity. And I was like, well, I was sort of a child of the 60s and early 70s, and I was like, well, what difference does it make? I mean, why, who cares? And she said, well, it's important that you know why when I was your age, people spit in my face. That was her comment to me. And, that sort of bounced around in my head for a couple of years. And so when I got here and saw that I could take a class in Jewish studies from Richard Hecht, I took that class, and then I fell in love with the whole idea of a religious studies major, because I was seeking this kind of broad liberal arts education, and that's how I got to Walter Kapp's class, and so I mean that's the backstory. I don't know if I can get to the other part afterwards.
Yeah. Why don't we go to
Okay.
you?
Well, you're inspiring some backstory here, because Roberto Colasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, if anyone knows the book, has this wonderful question, but how did it all begin? And I think what comes up in this conversation, at the beginning of this conversation, is a question of origins. And I'm thinking back, so my Santa Barbara story starts oddly early. I went to undergrad at Columbia, but somewhere along the way I had been this is the tuba connection, although I don't play the tuba. I had been a music person in high school, and I had been a composer, and I had put in an application at some point to the College of Creative Studies, where Tomoko and Walter taught in the 70s. And I won a scholarship to UCSB's CCS that I couldn't take because I was already committed to go to Columbia. And shortly after my sophomore, was it my sophomore year? It was my first year. I don't need to go into the long version of how we got there. I found myself in the summer of 1991, the early summer of 1991, I found myself at a meeting of I believe it was called the Coalition for Democratic Values at the time. And this was the counterpart to the Democratic Leadership Council, which was the other wing of the Democratic Party at that time. Senator Kerry was talking about the Bush administration. There were obviously the Democratic Party was in the throes of an identity crisis. I mean, it's a Saturday, so the Democratic Party's in the throes of an identity crisis. And I listened all day to some interesting policy discussions. I was by probably 25 years the youngest person in the room. And at the end of the day, the person I had really come to hear walked into the room. He was the governor of a very small state in the southeast of the United States. And pretty young guy. Walked into boos and hisses from his Democratic colleagues and ended his speech to a standing ovation. And I thought, there's something here. And so a month later, I found myself driving this governor in my parents' Volvo all over LA as he was laying his plans for what would be an October announcement to run for president of the United States. And as we were passing the federal building, Veteran Avenue in LA, it's Veterans Day, I slipped in a cassette to the player, because does everybody know what a cassette is? Okay. And I said, Governor, if you're gonna run for president, I think this should be your theme song. And we played Don't Stop. And the aide in the back seat was ready to throttle me at that point because Governor Clinton and I had this banter going that was totally distracting. He's that kind of guy. But I then spent a lot of time in college. I'm telling the story because I spent some time in college working on his campaign, as Laura knows, and then she worked in the White House with George Stephanopoulos. When I did an internship in college at the White House, which was a challenging experience to say the least. It was a meaningful experience that actually set up some of my career interests in government innovation, but it was also a very challenging experience for a number of reasons. And I ultimately came back. I was an unhappy history major at Columbia, and I came back and I really solidified myself as a religion major with the advice from one of my mentors in this internship who said, if you can do something else, if you want to stay in politics, you will find yourself going up the ladder, and people will go up the ladder over you, and then they will climb over you as they go down the ladder, and if you are dependent on the ladder, you're not going to be fulfilled. Go get a degree. She was pretty colorful about it. She called it an FU degree that would allow you to step off the ladder at any time and have a career. And I ultimately chose religion and found myself in the spring of 1994 with a letter signed by Walter Capps, who was the chair of the department, admitting me to UCSB for the Religious Studies PhD program. And I was really excited to get to Santa Barbara, and I had it was a great fellowship. But of course, when I got there, Walter was nowhere to be found because he was busy running for Congress against Andrea Seastrand. So I was I'm going to go study with Walter, and I'm going to study with Wade Clark Roof, and I'm going to study with Philip Hammond and all of the greats. And we'll talk about this more as we keep going, but that's sort of my backstory. How did I get to know him? And I'll fast forward, which is that obviously the race did not go the way we had all hoped in 1994. What was it? 4 votes? 12,000. It might as well have been 4 votes, but it felt, 1,200, not 12,000, 1,200. I mean, it was like. He won by 12,000 in 96. Right, okay. So he lost by this tiny amount. It was 94. The country did a whole bunch of weird things in 1994. But I then ultimately found a way to connect with Walter over my doctoral exams the following year, and we got to spend some time together. So I'll come back to that. But that's sort of the backstory as someone who was really interested in politics and found my way, kind of backed my way into the study of religion because of my core interest in values and how they motivated people. And I always felt that the 1992 election was about values, and that Governor Clinton had done a really good job of showing people that it was not just, yes, it was the economy stupid, but it was also about building a connection around shared values.
That's perfect. Something that definitely influenced me by taking 2 of Professor Capps' courses were the storytelling. And so how appropriate that we're starting this panel with sharing our story. So my story is, I am a Californian. I grew up in Pasadena, California, first-generation college student, low income, mixed race. My father's African-American, my mother's white. My mother was a single parent. I wasn't even going to go to college. I had I had a learning disability. And I was a terrible student in high school. Hated history. That was my downfall for sure. And it was my math teacher. Katya, you got a fee waiver to take the SAT, which was a terrible score. But you get a fee waiver to apply to UC. So why don't you apply to UC? And I'm like, okay, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I'm from the last graduating class, I think, from a high school that can only apply to one UC campus. And back in the day, they were admitting anybody eligible. So it was probably you were just signed up and you can go. I do have spent my first 17 years working as a professional here at UCSB in the Office of Admissions, so I know how it works. But I wasn't even UC eligible. I was admitted on affirmative action. And I always like to tell folks that if there is a lot of criticism and skepticism around affirmative action, but having earned my doctorate degree from UCSB and the title that I have, if I'm not a living embodiment of what it can do for an individual and give back, then I don't know what is. So I came to UCSB, but it was true. I was not academically ready to be here. And I struggled. I still am amazed to this day that I graduated, and it was a lot of caring individuals, especially in student affairs with educational opportunity program, having a counselor there, and people rooting for me. I spent a lot of time in Campbell Hall. I worked for arts and lectures and work study, and I had a wonderful supervisor that championed me. So a lot of loving individuals helped me get through college. I remember sitting in this classroom taking the Vietnam War, the Vietnam course, and hearing the stories and being very impacted by hearing individuals that had their own struggles or were treated a particular way. I heard in the last the comments, at that time when I graduated from UCSB in 1988, so the AIDS epidemic. So another course that really was impacting me was in the sociology of AIDS. And also I took the Baldwin's Sociology 152, the sex class. And what they all had in common was hearing the stories of real people and not triumph, but what we call today more the grit, and learning people's history and story. And I think that's what gave me some confidence that I could do this. I could get through UCSB because other people had gone through a whole bunch and they managed to get to the other side. And so my story being first generation, mixed race, so poor, oh my gosh. I celebrate today what we do on college campuses around basic needs and food pantries, getting students computers who can't afford to get their own computers, all of that. I only wish I had some of those resources when I was an undergraduate, because I went without very often. And it was hearing the stories of welcoming Vietnam vets back and helping them feel belonging, because I think that's what I got from that class, is starting to feel like I belonged. And then I took the first course he taught, Voices of a Stranger, which again, it was highlighting the triumphs of folks that looked like me, who had AIDS, who had disabilities, and seeing what they had done with their life, and seeing how he welcomed them and told them that they belonged, really impacted me and helped me graduate from UCSB. So let's...
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking a lot about what Walter's influence on me has been in the I feel the need, because we're in this space, and this is also a religious studies conversation. I feel the need to acknowledge those who aren't here with us and yet still are here with us, very much in mind. For me, Ninian Smart, Clark Roof, Phil Hammond. I know for many others, Dick Comstock, Bob Michelson. We are a department that honors our history. There are many others, but what I've been thinking about, and Clark was my dissertation director, and Walter and Lois were great friends to Clark and Terry, also blessed memory, who spent the last, I think, 30 years of their lives in Santa Barbara, and shared losses as well. But thinking about the different kind of influence that Walter had on me from others, and I went back and I looked at the exams that I wrote. I was his last graduate student, technically, in the sense that I took a doctoral exam with him in late August, early September of 1996, and then he technically was on my committee posthumously, and I didn't finish until 2013. That's a longer story, but Walter. So Walter had not succeeded in going to Congress in 1994, and I had come to meet him and to work my way into doing an exam with him, and in the middle of that, but he was clearly going to be running again, and in the middle of that was, of course, this horrible car accident that Walter and Lois were in. I'm now hearing that it was on the day of Sarah Taylor's dissertation prospectus defense. Sarah, where are you? You're somewhere here. And that grounded him for many months, but it also gave me the opportunity to go over the house. Everybody talks about going over to their house. It gave me the opportunity to go over the house a lot, and we studied together. We studied together the material for my exams, and that's where we started reading together the work of Václav Havel and Jan Patočka, and I had the opportunity to get to know Walter and Lois's daughter, Lisa Capps, who was rising star in psychology, was working with Eleanor Oakes at UCLA, and was writing about narration of self in her own work. I think she had worked with autistic kids in her own research, and understanding the formation of self. And her loss later was just heartbreaking. But in that moment, it was amazing to see Walter collaborating with Lisa in this work. We were trying to dig up the writing she did on Havel as well, because he looped her into that. And really, I talked a little bit about this yesterday briefly. Really, what was going on was the notion, and I'm thinking about this as a phenomenology of empathy, yesterday or the day before, Julie Ingersoll, another one of Walter's students, who also had a strong connection to the house, talked about making the strange familiar and the familiar strange as the part of the ethos of religious studies at UC Santa Barbara. I think that's really true. But if from Clark Roof, we spent a lot of time figuring out what I was going to study, and Mark Juergensmeyer, who is still a conversation partner, especially these days with the crisis, we're sort of understanding the way people talk to each other or what they're talking about. With Walter, it was the why. And I went back and I looked at the exams that I took with him, and I was so struck at how what I wrote about for him has continued to be a thread of how I do what I do and why I do what I do. Not the what, not the sort of statistical methodology or ethnographic methodology, but literally the underpinning of the relationship among human beings, between human beings, and how we honor one another. And that has, I mean, it was stunning to me to see that. And I think it's a phenomenology of empathy for him. And I see it in Lois's congressional career. I see it in Laura's career. I see it in Todd's work. I mean, it just shines through the way the family lives its life and serves the community. And I think it's shot through all of us. I mean, last thing I'll say on this, like, light bulbs go off, right? Ed Linenthal, where's Ed? You know, Ed has spent his career, the work on the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the work on the Oklahoma City, the work on, it's engaging with survivors, in conversation with survivors and the people who perished. I don't want to call them victims because that's a very complicated word. The work, the unfinished nature of all of this, but again, running through that is the notion that we have to do more than listen. We have to be bound in some form by our obligation to the people whose voices are not fully heard, who should be heard more, in the way that we then go about understanding the situation, or, you know, in the government sphere, making the decisions that we have to make. I'm going to stop there.
You know, I've just been, I mean, hearing all of this. My relationship with Walter, it's again, was a very, it's very subtle compared to a lot of the people who are reminiscing about him. Again, I was an observer of him more than an interactor of him. At 19 years old or whenever it was when I met him, I was taken by such, the small things about him. You know, his wit and his ease and his grace. And, this sort of smoldering intellect that was sort of hidden underneath a kind of unassuming approach to things. And it's really hard to sort of quantify the impact, but to build off of the story that I told about coming here without much of an educational background and just exploring who I was and thinking for the first time. I'd taken several classes, or a few classes with him, and never interacted with him. I sat in the middle of the class or the back of the class or whatever it is, and that was the extent of it. And one day I got a paper back from him, and the papers that I wrote, by the way, because I was not a rote learner, I was not I realized that what I could do, I was starting to develop a voice as a writer, I could write these papers, and I could incorporate things about myself, and they weren't so academic. They were more revealing kind of papers, where I was exploring things. So anyway, I get this paper back from him, and it says, "Please come see me in my office hours." Right? So I go to see him, and he says, "I noticed that you've taken a few classes, and we haven't really gotten to know one another, and I just wanted you to know that you have a very interesting mind." right? And for me, it was, like this epic thing that nobody had ever singled me out as being, intellectually interesting or having much to say about anything. And so for me, it was a moment of sort of infinite possibilities out of just that one interaction. And then, by the way, he undercut it with, of course you can't spell "where the damn" is what he said. So, but, in looking back, there is a thread, there is a direct line to the things that I have informed my writing. I'm sort of a one-issue candidate about a couple of things. I have like one thing that I do over and over again about interconnectivity and this idea of hope and hope was a huge, as we all know, was a huge word that was unpacked in many, many ways through the multiple classes that I took. But this concept of hope that I'd never really ever thought about before as a tool, as a kind of almost a weapon for positive change in the world, that's something that clearly has impacted the stuff that I've pursued as a writer.
Can I ask you to expand on that? Because I was reflecting on, I think I watched every episode of Heroes and Heroes Reborn, but I also watched Treadstone, and I also watched the show, which I'm blanking on the name, about the murder in Jerusalem.
Dig.
Dig. And we were talking about Touch yesterday. Mm-hmm. And particularly, I'm thinking about the characters of Noah Bennett and the character of Sylar, and in Treadstone, these agents who'd been brainwashed. And I think also running through your narrative, your character building, are of people whom they've tried to break, or who have been through breaking, profound breaking, and who find wholeness. I mean, you even redeem your villain in Heroes, right? So it's not just hope, it's also that sense of belonging.
I don't know how much I can really say, other than I'm very fascinated by the questions of characters that are pursuing their purpose in life, their meaning, their goal. Destiny is a big part of, and finding your purpose, and part of that is about becoming a whole. And so characters that start off broken, it's a jigsaw puzzle for me to figure out how to make them whole. So,
yeah. That's fascinating. First of all, one of the things you touched upon in terms of your earlier political career, or helping start the campaign, and he's going to comment later, it made me think of Reza in Walter Kapps's campaigning in the Volkswagen Bug, and when you were describing your experience, I was seeing a parallel, and I thought that was really interesting. But let's Reza tell his story. And also, even my husband, we have an old Walter Kapps campaign, Elect Walter Kapps t-shirt that my husband still wears to this day. It's getting ratty, but we cannot throw it away. So I just wanted to mention that, because those were some good, fond memories. And I definitely was influenced by just how Reza was affected by this family in the home. And it always made me smile. And I was very close to Reza at the time. And I think I was Reza's boss at one point in admissions. So I just wanted to comment on that, but I'll let him tell his own story. I think so I'd mentioned in my story, and it's relevant, that I hated history in high school. That was my downfall. And what was so wonderful about coming to a research institution, going to college, is rediscovering what history really is, and not taking a traditional history course. And I think taking the Vietnam course reintroduced and made me understand, appreciate, I'm not going to say love, but just this deeper connection to what history is about when it has a context. I felt like in high school I was being fed, excuse the term, but, old white guys conquering and memorizing dates with my mind and mixing numbers that didn't that didn't do anything for me. And I would say that Vietnam course helped me, ground me in the importance of context and what was going on at the time, and being able to focus on something, focus on the stories of these folks who had these experiences, and then being able to read about it and make sense in my mind what had just happened, and definitely solidify for me in my head that war is not the answer. That's what I got from it, and I still live to that, to this day about that. Whether it's idealistic or not, that's just how it affected me. I took also Women in American History, because I now was brave enough to, and I had to take history courses. You have to graduate. So it helped. It helped make me feel more comfortable entering into the realm of studying what has happened in the past and how we have reacted, and seeing it from different angles. And I thought he just did a really nice job for me, influencing me to be able to look at what has happened in our past in a different way. And permission that it's not just one way of looking at things. There are so, people are affected differently, people play parts in history differently. It just opened that lens, widened my lens. And now I can even read. I love to read. And in fact, I try to read at least a book a month, and I remember, only fiction, and now I've definitely gotten more into autobiographies, and I love historical fiction, and I think because of some of the training that I got in that class of being able to look at it differently, it has helped me immensely in seeing the world differently.
Listening to you, I'm reflecting on some of the work that I've done since, particularly in government, which I would mention because it's obviously so important to the legacy, Walter's legacy and Walter's family's legacy. Lois spent her career in Congress lifting up the voices of people who hadn't been lifted up. I'm thinking of nurses. Legislation that provided for support for nursing in this country that had not been previously acknowledged. Laura is tackling, the challenges here. County government's the best. It's the best job. It's the best job because you are at the intersection of everything. And Laura is now tackling, right, these mind-bending issues around housing and around how we literally keep our environment safe in an era of climate change. One of the things that has come up for me, I'm not in elected politics. I have the greatest of respect for those who can do that. I've been in appointed politics. And thinking back on the work that I've been able to do, a lot of it has involved making sure that voices that were not heard in the process were being heard. Back in 2017 on the Social Services Commission, I tried to hold hearings on how we could support people who feared deportation, because it was, if you remember the days of instant isolationism under the Trump regime, and people who were immigrants, mixed status homes, were deeply, we are still dealing with the trauma of that moment in our history. And I was told to stay in my lane, and I said, no, I'm not going to stay in my lane. We had college students facing, as you said, right, housing insecurity, food insecurity, people trying to build a shelter, some of the earliest shelters for college students, because there wasn't enough housing, and what there was unaffordable, and kind of not staying in our lane to be able to get that supported. On the Quality and Productivity Commission, which this is the link back to my White House internship, because I was on Reinventing Government, and now I've been able to spend the last 10 years on this really little-known county commission that funds and rewards innovation in government. And we have spent a lot of time making sure that when projects come to us, they are not just for the people they serve, but they are with the people they serve, and they reflect that those voices are not just heard, but they are present in the work that we are doing. And some of that can get into the fine grain, right? Some of that is really detailed. It's got, it's in the words of the legislation or the way that the program is developed. And when I finished being chair of the Quality and Productivity Commission, and I had there was this moment, and this is not a brag. I don't like to share these as. There was this moment where I was up in front of the Board of Supervisors, and Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, who's a true hero in this work, was describing what I had done, and then she flipped the script and she said what I had done was build trust in government. And save the cheerleader, save the world. There is a moment where, and I think this is part of Walter's genius, where we make the connection between hearing and honoring a voice. And when we hear and honoring, but this is the point that Sheila was making when this was not about me, this was the end of 2019 when trust in government was really low, right, still is. The point was, when we actually listen to one another, when we actually bring the voices of the unheard into the conversation, that is how we do the Tocquevillian, Havelian, big picture, godly work, right? I mean, there's a level of transcendence here of restoring the bonds between the people and the government that it's supposed to be by, for, and with all of us, right? So there's that local to global, right? Which is why I said what I said about the cheerleader in the world. And Walter made that connection. He made that connection real, and he made that connection urgent.
There's a to drill down on that, just in the way that, and this goes back to the impact that he had on me. I took a couple of classes in my memory. They were very small. I can't remember how many, but they were very small classes, and we had a chance to, and they were very Socratically taught. There was a lot of group discussion, and I just kind of wanted to go back a little, because I think that some of that DNA of what you're talking about is built, not just empathy, but generosity. The idea of I was very struck by, and I lead, writers' rooms that are creative, think tank kind of environments, and I don't know that I consciously think about Walter, but I definitely am influenced by his approach to pulling the best out of people. That there was a sort of and I'd sort of define it as a generosity, a bigness. He was very big. He loomed very large, without sometimes being big is being the least talkative in the room, right? Sometimes it's saying the least and letting the others have their moment, and that's something that I think was enormously impactful for me, and really gets to, I think the logical extension is what you were talking about, but in the smaller microcosm of 7 people sitting around, you could see the seeds of that. The other thing I'd like to sort of steer this a tiny bit to is the sense of humor and the silliness. If there was a joke to be had, he would lean in that direction. He'd go out of his way to find the joke. And I want to get just quick tell a quick story about a memory that I have of him coming in one day and starting the lecture by saying, I just want to tell everybody that I had notes, and they were really great notes, and everything was really, it was going to be a Academy Award-winning performance, but my dog destroyed the notes, or ate the notes, or something. Somehow the notes were destroyed by the dog. And that's how he started the lecture, right? And so about 10 or 15 minutes into the lecture, the dog becomes a character in the lecture, right? And he weaves the idea of the dog and the dog destroying the notes, and suddenly you realized, and I forget what the subject was, but you realized that he was using this story as a metaphor to explain what it is that he was trying to, and you watched through the class like a wave as everybody got it, right? And the light bulb, and people was suddenly looking at each other, and afterwards people talking, and on the way out of the class, do you think the dog really ate the notes? And but it was just such a, it was sort of like jazz, it's kind of like a free like a jazz musician, and I just remember that it was all, but there was a twinkle in his eye about the whole idea of it. He was, whether he was coming up with it, extemporaneously or it had all been planned, I'm not sure, but it was a moment of real brilliance.
That's beautiful. I believe that he had some humor. I think what I remember is more warmth. And, in thinking about this, it reminded me of the Maya Angelou quote. I'm not saying this verbatim, but, it's not what someone says, it's how they make you feel. And so that's what really was important to me in that classroom. So, and I bet that happened a lot. It was a long time ago, y'all. And I'm probably not, I know I'm not the oldest person in this room. But it's the warmth, and that's what I really remember about the classroom. What about you?
Yeah, Tim said something that reminded me, I think, and this goes back to this notion of the what and the why in my own thinking and learning. And Walter, the other thing about the exams that I wrote for him is the experience of working with him was about pulling from me what was me, right? It wasn't, he wasn't the teacher who brought in some other theory and blew your mind because you were going to now see the world in a whole new light. He was showing you something that was there all along, in yourself and in people around you and in the ideas that you were swimming in. And that's very powerful. You said pulling out of you, and we felt seen, I think. And I think he also thought it was in some way, terribly funny to the professor running for Congress. That was, I think he kind of got a kick out of that. He did tell, we did have one kind of exchange early on. Havel came to Congress, and I don't think Walter was on the was Walter on the Foreign Affairs Committee? I don't think was he? But he was a junior member. It was some issue that Havel was coming, and Walter wanted to get into the meeting with Havel because he had written about Havel, and he got to go, and it was a seminar. It became, all of these politicians who wanted to do the political thing with the president of the Czech Republic, and Walter was like, this is Václav Havel, people, right? This is big ideas, and just the joy of that. And it was a little bit of a, yeah, we can have a seminar in Congress. We can have a Walter Capps class on Capitol Hill. That is allowed, people.
Yeah, I do remember being in the undergraduate, feeling really far from politics, really far. I wasn't a poli-sci major. I didn't know much about the government. We didn't have social media back then, so it wasn't, in my feed talking about it. So it was pretty fascinating to watch him go through, running for government, not winning, and then doing it again. It got me a lot more interested. I became more informed just because it's like, oh my gosh, that's my professor. What is he doing? What does this mean? What does politics look like? So I think that was a really interesting thing for all of us at UCSB who maybe had not really paid attention to what government looks like or how you enter it. To watch him do that, that was pretty fascinating.
I remember it was years after I'd taken classes from him when I found out that he was running, and at first it was like, what, how? And then as I thought about it, you realize how much sense it made and the shape of his his arc, the ideas that he had been teaching, the ideals and the concepts and now finally being able to put those to use for the public good was a real trajectory that I think made a lot of sense. And when you really looked at it from afar, you realized, boy, this is kind of what the founding fathers really wanted. They wanted people who were big thinkers and accomplished people at a certain point in their life when they've done this much and achieved it. Then they go and serve their country. And it wasn't this idea of doing it as a vocation from the beginning of your life. You were to do that when you actually had something to offer. And I thought there was a real beauty to the shape of how he built the arc of that for himself.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like a dare. Like, well, you know so much. Well, yeah, I do. I can do this. And it was a great demonstration of, yeah, I can do this. I can actually be of service in this way as well.
And the number of people who are inspired by that, irrespective of the outcome, right? The value of it was not, the value of it was obviously Walter in Congress, but the value of it was also what you just said. It was the number of people who, when he was running or when he was in Congress or years later, people I would talk to who remembered the campaign in Los Angeles, around the country, around the world even, people who were inspired by that very idea of someone as smart and as caring and as ethical and as humane as Walter was, bringing his voice to be one of those, 535, and yeah, that's what government should be. I mean, how far we have fallen.
We could use some of his lessons moving forward.
Yeah, he stood out then, but man, would he stand out now.
I know, yeah. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I was thinking, well, why me? I didn't have a strong relationship with him. I was, that scared little undergraduate sitting probably right over there, just trying to keep up, taking notes, having my mind blown. But I'm sure I've met him several times. I was in his class, but he didn't know me super well, if at all. And so I was really like, why are they asking me? And then it occurred to me that, oh, well, I guess I have a relationships with the CAP Center. And I've certainly lived my life in service, which I think is a lasting impression that he left on me. And I teach this little class called Civic Engagement Scholarship. And Laura was just in our class presenting. She was amazing. And this class, I just wanted to share a little bit about this class and seeing maybe the really strong connection and how cool it is to be sitting up here and thinking about hopefully living a little bit of his legacy is this class that a colleague and I, well, actually we worked with a third colleague that worked for the CAP Center, and it was her idea, but she ended up leaving the university, and Viviana Marsano in my office, who is our civic engagement person. She has a long title, but that's besides the point. She and I have run with this class, and that's the third year we're teaching it. It's a year-long class. It rests in religious studies. It's Civic Engagement Scholars, and the concept is the fall quarter, we teach what civic engagement is. And we have definitely learned that students, they'll think it's voting. And you're done. You've done your civic engagement. So we're really trying to tease it out to really understand where their place could be and imagine. And we have lots of guest speakers. Ethan here from Isla Vista Community Service District. We have founders of the district come and speak to our class and talk about how, as students and recent alums, how they created the Community Service District. We have our representative of the supervisor from the board, Laura, has come. We had Joan Hartman a couple of years ago when she was our representative. We start with Dick Flax, who talks about the history of activism in this area, and he zooms in, and I always warn the class, now, it's going to feel like, this old white man is just talking at you, but pay attention. And by the time he's done talking, they have so many questions. They're so excited. Their minds are blown. We have a lot of nonprofits come and present. So we spend, and in between, I do a lot of leadership development with them. Viviana does a lot of constructive dialogues. We have Professor Tanya Israel talk about difficult conversations. So we're really trying to prepare them for the next step, which is to actually have a project for the winter and spring quarters. And it's about sharing stories. It's about talking the different ways of getting involved. We have school teachers come and talk about mentoring youth. We really try to expand their mind and see where their special place in civic engagement rests. And a lot of that really does come from Viviana Marzano has her degree in history from UCSB. She's from Argentina and new Walter Caps. And so we definitely have been influenced and are trying to lead a piece of his legacy through the class and get these students engaged. We need them so badly to want to make a difference, to get involved, to be leaders, to figure out where their special place is. And that's something that I definitely gained from Walter's class going forward. So I'm curious, continue that conversation. How has that landed you where you are today and you see strands of his legacy in your work?
I think it's so important that people can see themselves in the work of holding the civic community, right? I mean, one of the biggest challenges is people, as you say, right, thinking that it starts and ends with voting, right? And I've done work in the past. We created a program that won a Democracy Prize that focused on encouraging diverse service on boards and commissions in Los Angeles. We recruited from across multiple faiths and ethnicities to come to this training because we wanted to do two things. We wanted to both diversify who is on these boards and commissions. There are so many structural barriers to service right now. I mean, childcare, people who can't, or elder care, that can't afford to take time off from work or can't leave somebody alone because the commission meets from 10 to 12 or it meets from 5 to 7, right? People who think that they're not qualified because they don't have a college degree, they don't look like the people whose photos are on the wall. They need to be able to see themselves in this work, number one. And number two, what do we do, and this is, getting worse and worse by the day, when folks come in to try to break that down, to disrupt the work of government, to bring a level of hate or even violence, right? I mean, that we saw. If I think it would have been hard. I think it was, Walter had a big heart. I don't know how he would have, what January 6th did to all of us, right? Like we needed him in that moment, right? To bring us back together. But people who are doing this work, and this is work at the county level or the city level that is about building equity, that it's about building dignity, and they're getting disrupted by those who don't want those things for others. And so how do we do that work? How do we do that work of bringing people into the process, showing them that they have a voice, that they have a role to play, and making that space? And I'm very much aware of how I present in the world and what I look like and how old I am and what my background is, and I feel that it is absolutely vital to broaden who is at the table and to be a voice of broadening, right? That is if we talk about checking our privilege or doing that work, checking my privilege means that I need to be a voice for broadening and to make sure that we're always doing that work and not just taking it for granted that I'm sitting at the table. And I think that's what Walter did every day with the courses that he taught, was to bring, I think Julie made this observation yesterday, it might have been Sarah, that going back to the work, Walter's writings from the 1970s and the 1980s, read fresh today, right? The times were different, but his openness, his concern for the dignity of those who were different from him, those who looked different from him, but with whom he could find common ground, those are the, that spirit was with Walter from the beginning, and he's a model in that sense for the work of broadening what the civic commons can be.
You know, I'm seeing a lot of, as you're talking about this, I'm seeing a lot of DNA of what I have been trying to do as a storyteller in all of this idea of bringing people into the process. You know, just to sort of jump to the punchline of where my arc of my, I started off as in traditional television, there's a one-way street idea of relationship with the people who are watching or consuming your content. You make it and push it out into the world, and they consume it, and you have no relationship with them. And all that obviously changed with the internet, and suddenly that one-way street could become a two-way street. You had a very dynamic relationship with an audience, and I became fascinated in that idea that the audience actually could interact with the content and with the story and become a part of the story. So, you know, the big heroes fan base that was suddenly could find one another and interact and form groups and all of that. I tried to take it to the next logical conclusion. And again, the through line of all of this is that I think there is a thread that goes all the way back to Walter and what he taught. The logical conclusion of this sort of interactive relationship with an audience was I started to explore the idea of multi-platform storytelling, stories that take place on these devices that we all carry in our pockets, and these devices are not just a content consumption device, they're a content creation device. They know where you are, they know where your friends are, they've got all of man's knowledge at the couple of clicks away. And so how could you now engage an audience to become actually participants in this narrative, right? And so I explored this whole idea. I did a big project called Conspiracy for Good, which explored the idea of people becoming characters within a narrative, and then ultimately having real positive results come out of it. So it ostensibly was a giant scavenger hunt using mobile phones on the streets of London, but it was done for Nokia, the big cell phone manufacturer, who at the time had about 75% of the market share for handsets in the world. And but anyway, as a result of this narrative that we had people running all over the place and telling story and online and in social games and mobile games, we built and stocked 5 libraries in Africa, and we gave 50 scholarships away to schoolgirls and donated 10,000 books. And it sort of proving out this idea that you could create a narrative where people could participate inside of and then have positive results happen as a result of it. And that's where they coined the term social benefit storytelling.
That's fascinating. One thing I just wanted to insert, I forgot to finish, that we have received a grant this last 3 years from the UC National Free Speech and Civic Engagement Center. And I can't help to think of how important it is that we have a center like that to remind us the importance of civic engagement. But I'm wondering what other stories that you might have that you want to share that we haven't touched upon, or any questions that you have. And then maybe we could go to the audience and see what they're thinking.
I'm just going to tell a quick story, just because it's apropos of nothing. It's just
we love that.
A memory, just a memory. I went, I took a class on monasticism, and Walter took about, it must have been 5 or 6 of us, I think, up to the Immaculate Heart Hermitage up near Big Sur. and on a silent retreat, right? And we were supposed to be silent for the week that we were there, and we took it really seriously. We all took it very seriously, and we weren't the only ones there. There were other people on retreat. One of them was Gregory Bateson, the British renowned anthropologist and married to Margaret Mead. He was one of the regents of the University of California at the time. And so we knew that he was there, and there were other people that were, kind of there. But we all took our vows of silence pretty seriously. And one day I was walking out to this lookout that looks out over the ocean, and I, ran into Walter, and we did the sort of nod to one another, like we were, and we walked together in silence and went out to the end of this lookout, and there was Gregory Bateson there. And it was a warm day, and he had his shirt off, and he was absolutely pasty, pale, glowing white, and we all sort of stood together looking out of it. And then Walter and I turned and started walking back, and he sort of leaned over to me and said in this kind of mock British accent, "Only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun." And like I said, it's apropos of nothing. It's just a memory. And it's just
great story.
He had to get a little zinger in there.
And they went back to being silent.
Yeah,
Right. I want to go out to the audience. I mean, I want to hear from the audience, but I don't know if we can have the lights up for a minute, because I would love to just see how many of Walter's students are in the room. If you actually stand up, if you were a student of Walter Capps, if he gave you a grade,
Wow.
Wow, yeah. So I mean, this is our community, and I'm gonna, and by way of going to the students, this is a weird connection. Where's Mike Madrid? Where are you, Mike? You're right there, I see Mike, and I see Shad, and I see who else? So many people. I'm just going to name those names. I'm thinking about the communities that formed immediately after Walter's passing. Clark hired me on to be. I was the first Capps fellow, and a junior fellow, something like that. And we put on this conference right away in 1999, I think it was Casa de Maria, thanks to Sarah Miller McCune. And immediately the community came together. And it was, and I want to stress this notion that from the get-go, the legacy of Walter Capps for all of us, with those who had been with him, right, as co-teachers, as co-designers, people who had been his students, people who were part of the Santa Barbara community, it was clear that this was a shared legacy. So often, and then I want to hear from people in the room. So often in the tradition of an academic, right, you think about the legacy as being owned by their students or their colleagues. And so the legacy kind of sits off up here, and we think about the intellectual genealogy of their ideas led to so-and-so's ideas, and just our conversation is about the humanity of it, right? And it's about, and what is that? How does that humanity express itself? It's in the fact that all of us, whether we were veterans, right? Whether we were strangers. To use the Voices of the Strangers metaphor, right? Whether we were undergraduate students, graduate students, whether we were Lois and Todd and Laura's and Lisa's neighbors, right? In Santa Barbara, whether we were people who knew of the Capps family, but we were in Santa Barbara as fellow residents, as fellow citizens, as fellow stakeholders in our democracy, people around the world who benefited from his work on the state humanities councils, and we heard from them yesterday. There is an extraordinary co-ownership of this legacy that I think is truly unique and deserves celebration. And I'm really glad that we've had these, we will continue to have these, this day, these few days, but I'm just so struck by all of that co-ownership, right? All of that Walter belongs to all of us. We all belong to Walter in some sense. And it is not in one sector or another, and that's part of what makes the legacy so powerful.
It definitely strikes me of how important this conference is for us to continue living the memories and moving us forward, because we have a lot of work to do, and we need people to continue to be engaged in civic engagement, to continue living the legacy of Walter. And I would love to hear if anybody first has any questions for us. Ooh, and then we'll have statements. And I'm going to start with Reza with the statements, but we'll start with questions first. The microphone's hot here. Looks like
Hello?
it. Yes.
Hi. I'm Amanda Green. I teach philosophy here at UCSB. And the title of this panel was Teaching Ethics and Civic Values, I think. And I'm just, as of yesterday, learning about Walter Capps, and it strikes me that he was a teacher of ethics. But he also wasn't really a teacher of ethics in the way that we would say that in the philosophy department, like ethical theory and the different ways of thinking about what it is to live a virtuous life, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to pose a question to each of you. What do you think it is to teach ethics? What did you learn from Walter Capps about teaching ethics? And I want to include the filmmaker here. I think you probably are a teacher of ethics, so please don't exclude yourself from answering. But could you reflect briefly on what it was to teach ethics for Walter and what it is for you and how you were shaped by that? Thanks.
I mean, my exam was on ethics, among other things. So, I mean, yes, we actually did. We were reading Habermas and right. So the question of ethics and communication, the question of I was looking over my exams. I'm not going to sort of read them off, but that we were dealing with that, right? And that's part of what I said comes back to me, because I ended up. My whole dissertation was an intersubjective definition of religion, understanding that where do we see religion as scholars of religion? It's, well, Tim and I have a conversation. If we find we're talking about the same thing and it's intelligible to Katya, then Katya can write about it, right? But if Tim doesn't understand me and I don't understand Tim, and Katya's looking at us and saying, you all don't make any sense, you can't make sense of it. And so there's an ethical dilemma of even the act of defining something from an observer standpoint. So we did explore those questions. I think what I would say is that we spent more time on the intersubjective. We spent more time on communication ethics. We spent more time on, and I alluded to this earlier. What was the value-based ethics as opposed to outcome-based ethics, right? Virtue-based ethics and it goes back to his campaign. Was the value of his campaign in the running, or was the value of his campaign in the winning, right? And that's where we talked about it, and I think, I would say I think that's largely been lost in the current American political system. I'd love to see more of it coming back, but it was very much on his mind, and I think part of what this notion of pulling us out of ourselves was Walter saying intellectually, the stuff that animates you, the questions that you're asking me, there's a whole intellectual tradition of people who were asking the same questions. Let's go talk to them and see how the questions they were asking and the way they were answering it relate to the way you're asking and answering those questions. And that was very powerful. So I think the teaching of to answer your question, I think how it influences teaching ethics is, for me, the ethics are when I'm in a government setting, okay? and we're dealing with a problem, I am very concerned to make sure that anyone who wants to be heard on the matter gets heard. And not that I necessarily agree with them, but for me, the moment of sort of the ethical standard that has to be reached is that we listened to the person, that we acknowledged what they were saying, even if ultimately we're not able to, in the context of a land use decision, say, oh yeah, sure, the number of people who come in and say, you can't build housing here or here because XYZ, right? I want to hear what they have to say. I disagree. We're going to build that housing. But the ethics of that decision-making process are rooted in the fact that we hear them, we acknowledge them, we try to address the underlying issue. If that's they don't like people, can't help them. But if it's that there's a problem they want solved, the ethics are that we make a good faith effort to try to solve that problem and then do the thing that we are called upon either legally or morally to do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Tim, do you want to go?
Yeah, so the classes that I took from Walter were, I took a class on Thomas Merton, took a class on monasticism, took a class on action theology. I'm not sure what it was called, but it was about that. And the big takeaway for me, the through line of all of it, was the spiritual beliefs that drive positive action, that drive people towards what are the foundations that create the basis for how you act in the world and how you act in a positive way in the world. And it's so baked into the DNA of how I write. I mean, a character is action. It's not really about what you say, it's what you do and what your actions are. And so I think, I think that I somehow have pulled from that, from these classes that I took with Walter, this idea that your core beliefs and your actions are connected to one another, and that's been the thing that I've explored the most in my writing.
For me, to be clear, I teach 2 classes here at UCSB, but I am a practitioner. I am not a professor. I'm reminded of that by faculty often, so I just want to be clear about that. Maybe that's a little bit of my imposter syndrome. The thing for me was the modeling of doing the right thing. You're going to make mistakes, things are going to happen, and I saw that modeling with the way, against the warmth of Walter and the way he set up his class in providing the voice of others and that belonging piece. And so that's what's very important to me in my classes and with the students that I work with daily. In our civic engagement class, we ask our students to do research on the folks who are the speakers and to think about ethics and to think about, how are they doing the right thing? What does service mean? In my leadership class, we actually talk specifically about ethical leadership and get them to think about that and even pose a case study. And so how would you approach this particular problem? And for them to be thinking in different ways, the different lenses that I talked about earlier that actually helped me feel that I belonged here at UCSB. And so I think ethics is the modeling, the asking critical questions, that critical thinking piece, and getting them to recognize. It's kind of like understanding policy. Like, we make a decision to do this, just like you talked about housing. So how does it affect people, all people, about where you're going to build that housing? And so teaching that and providing those opportunities for the students to think through all the different ways to approach the problem, right? And so my experience in Walter's class was the first time I started thinking critically about, oh wow, these people have different opinions, different experiences. Someone might have this identity or have had this experience. Where's the judgment? They're human. You know, where was the decision making in terms of how they got to where they were, or what their cultural background is, where the ethnic background is. So I just try to play that forward in my classes and provide the opportunity for students to think about it and not just judge, or, you know, get them to ask, why do we make particular decisions and who does it benefit?
I'd just add really quickly that, you know, my list had Bakhtin and Bauman on it, right? Which in the mid-90s, Walter was thinking about mechanization, right? The bureaucracy. He was also thinking about commodification in this post-war, post-Cold War moment. And I think that's a constant question. I think it's an ethical question of what does it mean to be human in the face of commodification, in the face of mechanization and bureaucratization, and how do you maintain human connection? Buber came up yesterday, right? How do you maintain those connections? And those are ethical questions.
Okay, so we have quite a line over here, but we're going to start with Reza. And Reza, I'd love to hear from you, your connection.
Thank you so much. Great to be home. First of all of you watching are wonderful speakers. I don't know about you, but I kept picturing Walter right behind that podium. And often when we had speakers in his class, he would look down, I was always in the front row, and he would just smile and nod when they made some really cool comment, and I kept seeing Walter. I mean, this is Campbell Hall, but for thousands of UCSB alumni, it's really Walter's house, okay? Yeah. And I'm so excited that Laura, we talked earlier that we decided to do it here. So my background, I went to UCSB, graduated 1993, had 5 wonderful years with the greatest boss in the world, who to this day still influences me. But I was in the Vietnam class. I got 3 quick, really funny stories of Walter. The first one was I was in the Vietnam class, and I decided to go to Washington to see the wall. And it happens to be that of all the people sitting on the plane, I got to sit next to Walter on the 5.5-hour flight. So it was just a lucky break. And we spoke, and I told him about my life growing up in Iran, in the revolution, escaping the Ayatollah, moving with my mom to India for 6 years, and coming to America as a 17-year-old. And many years later, when I worked at UCSB, I spoke in the Voice of a Stranger class for 3 years as a voice of a first-generation immigrant. So that was the connection we had. But as we talked, we really connected. And he whispered to me, he's like, hey, my daughter has an internship at the White House, and we have a private tour of the White House, and George Bush Sr. was in Kennebunkport, so that evening I got to go to the White House, and 2 of us leaned over the rope into the Oval Office, and we got to take pictures at the press room. And before we left, Walter goes, excuse me, can I use the restroom? And I said, can I go too? So we started walking towards the restroom. We looked like Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito and twins. You know? And he just whispers to me, he's like, I don't really have to pee. I just wanted to tell my friends I got to pee in the White House. You know? And I'm like, who is this guy? He's my professor. And I kept calling him Dr. Katz. He's like, call me Walter, you know. So years later, I got to work on the campaign with Ben and Tu and Laura. And First Lady Hillary Clinton was coming to Santa Barbara to campaign for us in Montecito at the old Miramar. And everybody was excited. And a couple of weeks before, the White House advance team said, we need somebody from the campaign to meet her at the airport. And everyone's like, you know, they're like, you're not going to go. You're from Iran. I mean, how are you going to get past security, right? You know. And sure enough, we were in the campaign room downtown. I remember that true story. And Walter says, you know, I've decided the person who's going to represent our campaign is going to be the person who really understands democracy, and he had to escape the Ayatollah. He's like, Reza, you're going to meet the First Lady. So I still have the picture in my mom's room. I got to meet First Lady Hillary Clinton and got an amazing picture with her. You know, for me, first generation coming from Iran, to get to meet who should have been the president was one of the greatest things. And the last story is after we won the campaign the second time, it was about 10 days after the campaign was over, and I had all my cousins and uncles here from LA at Ledbetter Beach to have a barbecue, and suddenly, just 10 days after the campaign, Walter and Lois showed up to our barbecue. And Walter, and I get teary-eyed when I think about this, told my whole family, he's like, if it wasn't for your son, I wouldn't have won this campaign. His work in Isla Vista, and you know, all of us, you know, being Iranian Americans, here's a future congressman coming here, taking time with wonderful Lois to come and say thanks to me. that was his legacy. So thanks for everyone for being here. We're going to do this one time because we did it several times in his campaign. Ole, 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 Walter, Walter. Thank you so much, Katya.
Yeah, next.
I have a question for you, Katya. I also was a first-generation college student and wasn't a particularly good high school student. No one thought I would go to college. Wasn't interested in history, but ended up, the humanities, or college really, just sort of blew my world apart. The infinite possibility that you talked about. And I did an undergraduate degree, got a PhD here in religious studies. Walter was one of my professors. My 30-year academic career, I've seen this sort of increasing corporatization and bureaucratization of higher ed, and I'm kind of interested in your perspective because I think you can give me something of a bird's eye view as somebody who's invested in the humanities, but somebody who also works in administration. I'm really worried about the future of higher ed because it seems to me that the rich kids are going to get what we got, and the other kids are not going to get that. It's all going to be rubrics and metrics and evaluations that ask you at the end of a class what you got out of it. And if we've seen anything over the last 2 days is that, like, most of us have no idea, even still, the breadth of influence of Walter and the program in our lives. And I'm wondering what you see. Is it like that everywhere? Is UCSB as humanities oriented as it was? Are there others, like across the country, are there a lot of places where the humanities are still surviving? And I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Thanks.
Well, actually, I saw David Marshall here. He probably could talk about humanities. But I'll just tell you what I am seeing. I am seeing an attack on higher ed. I am seeing an attack on free expression. The things that have provided access for first generation, for the middle class, for the wealthy. I mean, this is a leveling playing field when we come to the institution. Our incoming class is still made up of 30 to 40% first generation. And so they're still coming, and it's so important. But the impression that some folks are trying to make is that we don't need higher education anymore. And I think that's something we have to combat. I think we have to talk about belonging. I think we have to talk about the importance of critical thinking. As an undergraduate especially, and this is something I see every day, it is a chance to chew on things, to imagine, to make mistakes, to write a bad paper and get good feedback, to those, midnight to 2 a.m. conversations in the hallways of the res halls with different experiences, political leanings, to the crazy preacher in the Arbor area who's saying women should be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and students having a fit about it. They'll call me first and say, oh, this horrible person. And I come out and students are fascinated and they're having conversations. And I talk about free expression. They don't have to be there to listen. I'm all, but how are you affected? What are you thinking? What difference do you want to make about this person screaming these things that you don't agree with? Higher education is a gateway to a future for so many. And, and it's a chance, and I get really upset when outsiders come and protest something on campus. Our students, they should protest. They should, have horrible speakers on campus and people really be affected and decide, why they don't like that speaker and protest. And the ones that want the speaker should be allowed to have the speaker. I have those conversations with students every single day. But there is the they who is trying to see those liberal pansies, whatever they call us, in this ivory tower that doesn't need to exist anymore. And so I think we need to do a better job of talking about the importance of higher education, talking about the legacy of Walter Capps, and bringing people to talk to us about real life experience, talk about the strangers, uplifting those voices. And that happens every day on this campus, and it just kills me when, we are defunded. When I think about we have to have a bake sale just to be able to support our first-generation students so they get, basic needs or scholarships. So there's a lot there, but it is definitely this idea, and it's polarized in terms of the benefit and the importance of higher education. So that's what I'm seeing.
Can I just say, I don't know if anybody has seen this. I wish, as an alum, to go to the UCEN and to see that etched on the stone of the UCEN is an office dedicated to food security. What a failure of a society we are. Let me just say that we have to worry on a daily basis about whether or not the students at this university have enough to eat. We're doing something wrong, right? I mean, Lois and Laura have spent their careers trying to figure this out and advocating for the dignity of every single person in this congressional district, in this county, and yet the system is, I saw that and my heart broke, and that is what we're fighting. We're fighting a system that takes that for granted, and Walter would demand that we never take it for granted any day of the week.
Back in the day, we didn't pay tuition. Our students pay tuition now.
I just want to be cognizant of the time. We have 3 more public speakers here, so we'll take their comments. And then I want you all to know that there's a food truck out front when we're done here. Thank you. Please enjoy some food out front, and then we'll reconvene promptly at 2. We have a full afternoon of programming, so we're going to look forward to the last several public comments, and really want to thank our panel. This has been fantastic. Thank you. And thank you, Katya, for steering the ship.
Yep, looking at the time. 2 more people. We'd love to hear from you. 3 or 4. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can take all 4.
Absolutely.
Expeditious, and
Okay.
then we'll all enjoy lunch.
Perfect.
And I should add, speakers for the session, if it wasn't clear, we're having lunch across the way at Mosher. So if you're a speaker for the conference, please go there.
Perfect. Thank you.
My name's Claudia Caution, and I took Walter's class in 1985. The first quarter, it was actually in this room. And I also took his The Rise of the Moral Majority class the following quarter, and that was I was afraid then, and that was in 1985. So now we know where it all ended. But what was important, and it's been touched upon yesterday about his empathy, today it's about his legacy. I am an Army brat. My father had 2 tours in Vietnam. And just like Tracy said earlier today, one of the assignments in the Vietnam class is to speak to your parent who was in the war, or in my case, I wrote a letter with a bunch of questions, and I got it back from my father. My mother told me he was very upset when he got the letter. He did not want to answer my questions. And by the end of the letter, I could not read his writing because he was so drunk, because he was an alcoholic. My mom says he was a heavy drinker when he went to Vietnam, and he came back an alcoholic. And he was in his 30s. He was an officer. He had 2 tours. And, what I learned during the class is I got to understand my father. Even though the major thing that they noted is during World War II, the average age of a military man was 26, it was 19 in Vietnam. And I so remember the group coming back from the pilgrimage. I don't know if that was the first quarter that they did the pilgrimage to Washington, D.C., but a young man talked to us about how he found his name among the names, and he went and he looked at the name on the wall, and the person died. That young man died at the same age as he was, 20 years later. And so it was a very empowering and very important course for me as a daughter of a Vietnam veteran. I got to understand my father better. I then moved on. Your reason for this particular panel is like, what did you do beyond? Well, I ended up getting an internship with a project on the Vietnam generation in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1986, and I got to know Jack Wheeler and Sandy Forial, who worked with Jan Scruggs to build the Vietnam Memorial. So that was really special. And then, a few months after that, I got a job on the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, and Senator Cranston, Alan Cranston, was the chair, and so I worked for the next 3.5 years helping veterans. Now, mind you, I was a little person on the committee, but I learned about the issues that were affecting veterans. And my father eventually got ill, and he died in a veterans hospital. So I knew a lot of things that were happening, and I understood it better, and I knew the context because of Walter's class. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeff Greenfield, and I did not take any caps from Walter Capps, but I have one story that Lois and Laura wanted me to tell you. You should think I know how to use this. I came out here in '96 during the second campaign to do a piece for Nightline on the campaign, and also to get an all-expense-paid trip to Santa Barbara. So I sat down with Walter, and after a while I said, I don't understand something. You have this amazing job, you are renowned, you are beloved at a great university. You're in this gorgeous house in one of the most beautiful places to live with a great family. Why, and you are a senior citizen, why would you want at this point in your life to go 3,000 miles away and be a freshman member of the minority caucus? And Walter said, it's really my chance to see how the ideas of the framers are actually working out in reality. I want to see whether their hopes, their experiments, their fears played out. Now, one more quick point. It would be interesting to know how Walter would regard that today, whether he thinks the experiment is working. I simply wanted to share that with you because as somebody who did not have your advantage of being in Walter's class, even that one exchange told me this is really an extraordinary man. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Jeff, for coming back over and over again to help share Walter's legacy. Because you've come back for conferences and you've brought your national voice to Walter's legacy, and I just want to acknowledge you for having done that.
Well, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ethan Bertrand. I represent Isla Vista and part of UCSB on the Goleta School Board. I'm an alum here, and my first political experience was working for Congresswoman Capps on her 2014 campaign. Thanks for the panel today. One question I have that kind of dawned on me as I was sitting there is we've talked a lot about how public confidence in politics and government has declined. And I was also thinking about this being in the religious studies department. Public confidence and trust in religion has declined too. And when you put the two fields together, when people think about politics and religion and the intersection, a lot of folks are scared. What lessons from Walter Capps' legacy can help us there, help us find a better future and more, I guess, peace in existing? And this might be a conversation we continue at lunch, but that was on my mind. Thank you.
I'm going to have you react, but brevity is important. They're hungry.
I'll just say, I think a religion is, connection. Ultimately, Walter was working out really big questions in interpersonal relationships. And I think if you go back to that core, healthy government and healthy religion is about healthy connection. It can get diseased really fast, and he was fighting that disease when he portended the rise of the religious right, and we've seen that, and we heard from Julie Ingersoll, who just wrote, asked the question of you, Katya, but she has carried forward Walter's legacy in her writing on American evangelicalism. But for me, I think it's connection, and I noted the same thing when you said, "Wow, civic engagement in the religious studies department." I think that's really cool.
I would just say that this is why we teach constructive dialogue in our civic engagement class that is in religious studies. And we bring great folks like you to come speak to our class to see the connections. in whatever major they are, but it's really cool to get them into the religious studies department, even through an interest of what civic engagement is, and to see the relationship so that they can take it with them in wherever direction they go. Because in my class, they're all different majors. They just tripped and fell into the class. And I think capturing them and getting them to think about ethics and think about how they're going to be engaged in the future of this country, in their county, in their town, and getting them to really want to buy into that they can actually make a difference. Okay, thanks, Ethan.
Hi there, I'm Marnie Michalowski, and I had Walter's class twice. Once in, I think, 85 and again in 86. I took an independent study with Tracy and Lisa. And so much of what you were all saying, I just identified with so deeply about who he was and what he left in us. And I'm so grateful, and I find it a little bit stunning. We're all still feeling it like it was yesterday. You know, it's so palpable still. And he had such a subtleness to him, but what a power, you know? And we were just talking at the break about, you know, sort of the goofy side of him, where he was so understated and didn't take himself so seriously, and he was one of us. And I remember when I took an independent study and I approached him to kind of talk about, like, what am I responsible for? You know, what are the requirements? And he just went, and I was like, okay. And what I learned was, it was the journey. It was all about the journey. And because I'd had it before, I was already touched deeply and everything. So it was so different. There was nobody like him in terms of other professors that I had here. Because he really was about, as Lisa was saying, you know, we did so much soul searching. The class stirred so much in us that we didn't even anticipate that. We just showed up, we heard it was a cool class and, you know, some powerful moments and things. But just grateful for that journey, because it truly was transformative for me. And thinking of him again, where that he was so approachable, that feeling that I felt seen and heard like I had not before in my journey of learning and everything. And that's stuck with me so deeply, and I try to walk that, you know, with my kids, with my community, being quiet, honoring everybody where they are in their journey. And yeah, just grateful. I think the power of that class was in the personal narratives that were spoken, and the vulnerability that was shared opened up so much in me. You know, I was very introverted and kind of was used to a kind of a rote approach to learning, and it just blew up everything. So just grateful, and just the generosity and capacity that he had is stunning, because we all have the same story in a different context. So just want to say thank you, and grateful that you all made this opportunity available to us, and grateful to have walked that time with Walter.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So, food truck outside. Go help yourself to lunch, and we reconvene at 2 p.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, everybody.